Hello everybody and welcome back to part 17 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. We start today not in space or on the launch pad as we have done in recent episodes, but on the runway with the latest iteration of our spaceplane. Since I introduced this craft 6 episodes ago, it's gone through a couple of design revisions, but I've mostly been focusing on other stuff. Soon though, it will have to be called into action on a reasonably regular basis, so it's time to expedite that development process. So this is the latest iteration, and this is the first full test run of this particular design, which I will be taking you through warts and all, and yeah, there are some warts. But our mission is a simple one: get up into space, circularize our orbit, make our way to the new space station, dock, undock, make our way back home again, and make a note of the amount of delta V we have left as we enter the atmosphere. Now, while this design can certainly be improved upon, and probably will be improved upon, I think we now have a craft that, for what I need to use it for in the short to medium term, is a serviceable craft. The biggest change between this craft and the one you saw in an earlier episode is the number of engines. We still have those 4 Rapier engines, although their position has changed slightly, and we use those to get us into orbit and to circularize. But once we are in orbit, then those 2 other engines take over, those 2 engines in the middle. These are engines we've unlocked very recently. These are the liquid core nuclear engines. They get an ISP of up to 1600 seconds, and they have a thrust a little over 60 kilonewtons each, which is more than enough for our manoeuvring purposes. There is a slight complication with these engines because they are effectively an open cycle nuclear engine. You can't use them in the atmosphere, or even close to the atmosphere with the exhaust pointed in that general direction, as I found out as I was making my orbital transfer burn to take us to our rendezvous with the new space station. Apart from that, there were a couple of other hiccups on the way up. On the aforementioned burn, I started burning a little late. As we're approaching the space station, I start burning well too late. We zoom straight past it, but we do manage to get that sorted out. The craft manoeuvres quite well. I did take a lot of extra care trying to balance this as much as was practicable for manoeuvring. Those linear RCS ports which I'm using do make a fair bit of noise. We're not quite back to the bad old days of the shuddering RCS when you've got stability assist on, but it's not quite ideal. As I mentioned, Grayford and Eris and Kerbin have got a pretty simple mission. They just need to get up and back, so they dock, they undock again, and start to make their way back home. Everything goes well on the way down. We lower our orbit, we perform our deorbit burn. It's when we get into re-entry that the really big problems hit us. Now, slowing down at hypersonic speeds with one of these craft is a tricky beast at the best of times. I won't go into too much detail, but generally speaking, it pays to pump fuel forward and make sure your nose doesn't drift too far away from the prograde direction. I failed to do either of those things here. So we do flip out. I try to regain control, I try manually, I try to see if the SAS can get it pointing prograde. Neither of these work. It's not until we drop into the thicker atmosphere and at lower speeds that I do finally manage to regain control. This does kind of ruin our re-entry plans. We do come up well short of the KSC. One of the positives of using a space plane is that if you do come up short, you can just kick in the jet engines and just cruise the rest of the way, but we are so far short that we don't even have enough fuel to do that. Realising this, I alter our course and aim to put ourselves down on a flattish bit of grassland. The craft's done pretty well in this test. We got into orbit with about 1800 meters per second of delta V to spare. If we want to compete with the Brunel CMS, we're gonna need at least 2,500, I think. As I mentioned earlier, I think we have a serviceable craft here. I think most of the major problems we ran into were procedural rather than technical, so I think this craft can do its job when called upon. So with that reassuring news out of the way, we turn our attentions to our orbital science station, the Aristotle. As I mentioned in the last episode, the clock is already ticking on the Aristotle. Our interplanetary craft, the Galileo, is about 130 days away from Kerbin, and I want to get everything transferred across to the new space station and the Aristotle decommissioned before it arrives. At the moment, our efforts are focused on running down the data in that science lab, converting it all to science and getting that transmitted back down to Kerbin. We have about 235 data left in the science lab. If we can knock another 100 off of that, then I think I'll be happy. With that latest batch of science transmitted, we fast forward a little bit and join the Galileo about 50 days out from Kerbin. A little while to go yet then, but the perfect opportunity to check that we are getting a good encounter and to correct it if we're not. And what do you know? We're not. Partially because we're going to be a little further out than I'd like, partially because we're heading into quite a high inclination orbit, but mainly as things stand we're going to end up going the wrong way round Kerbin, so we need to perform a correction manoeuvre sooner rather than later. The further out you perform the correction manoeuvre, of course, the less delta V you need, and we're only going to need about 35 metres per second, so with that dialed in it's time to get the Galileo ready to make that burn. So we get the craft pointing the right way, we switch the engines back over to using liquid fuel because they keep switching over to using monopropellant for some reason, and then when the moment arrives we light up those engines. Having made the burn and having made some fine adjustments with the RCS, the Galileo is now set for a periapsis of about 7,500 kilometres, as I said, in about 50 days' time, but we've still got a couple of things to do before we get there. So, returning to the KSC, we are blasting off with one of our Brunel Mark I rockets, and in what has almost become a tradition for this series, we have a suitably ridiculous fairing attached. Corkin, Grados and Erison Kerman are with us for this one, and their mission, you probably won't be surprised to know, is to go up and deliver yet another couple of components to our new space station. Once these are attached, however, that will be it for the time being. The space station will have all the modules I wanted it to have before we transfer everything across from the Aristotle. So once that's done, all that remains is to run down the science in the Aristotle and, well, we've been through this, no need to go through it all again. Now, while I have enjoyed building this space station, and I'm really liking the way it's looking, and we will have to go up at some point in the near future and deliver a few more components, but it's kind of been all I've been thinking about for the last few episodes, so it'll be nice to focus on something else for a change, at least for a little while. Anyway, with our Kerbals reaching space, we can pop that fairing and see what goodies we have here. To start with, we have another one of those six-way nodes. This is an unpressurized structural version, and that's going to sit on what is currently the far end of that unpressurized section of our space station. Attached to that, we have our power module. This contains solar panels, batteries, and a large radiator. I'm not sure how many of these we're going to end up with, but without meaning to give too much away at this stage, before too long, our station is going to need quite a lot of radiator capacity. We may even have to send up some dedicated modules just to deal with this. Arriving at the space station, we can finally start our manoeuvres to get these bits bolted on, and this load is a little bit interesting to manoeuvre. Well, I say that, it's been interesting all the way up. Where it's an asymmetrical load, where the centre of mass is off-centre of the rocket, it did cause us some tiny minor problems on the way up, but now we're just manoeuvring with the CSM, and given that the heaviest bit of our load is on the far end because of the order we have to attach the stuff in, yeah, it made it quite interesting. I was quite happy when we got this node attached. After that, we can start to move our power module into place. Now, while the node was the heavy bit making manoeuvring interesting, the power module is the one with the slightly tricky centre of mass, but it's quite light, it doesn't cause us any real problems, and before too long we get that attached, and with that, our space station is ready for business. We deploy the solar panels, we deploy that large radiator, we retract their equivalents on that temporary utility module. We'll be getting rid of that at some point soon, but with the job well done, it's time for our Kerbals to start making their way back to Kerbin. Now recently I've been trying to see if I can land the command module either at the KSC or as close to it as possible. Our first two attempts didn't go badly, so I make some fine adjustments this time round, but this time we come up very, very far short. I'm starting to think that this is very sensitive to initial conditions, so I'm not sure how worthwhile this whole enterprise really is. Regardless, our Kerbals splash down safely in Kerbin's oceans and await their recovery. Fast forwarding some more, we find ourselves back with the Aristotle, the Galileo, a mere 4 days away from its encounter with Kerbin. We have managed to work our way through another 100 points of that data, and so we transmit the resulting 500 science back down to the surface, clicking the Stop Researching button as we do so. There's still 135 data left aboard that science lab, but I'm afraid that will be going to waste. The Aristotle has researched its last, and now our Kerbals begin making preparations to leave this space station for the very last time. Let's get this one started then. We've got a lot to get through in this mission. Greyfried Kerman is back at the helm and she is joined as ever by Erison and Grados. And we have, I think it must be the most sensible looking fairing I've had in a very, very long time. Now there were several different ways I could have done this mission, and at one point all of my current launch vehicles were in contention to do it, but in the end I decided to send the Brunel up. It was the easiest and safest way of doing everything in one go. Particularly as it has the best delta V of all of those vehicles. So we need to get up to the Aristotle, we need to get everything that needs transferred across to the new space station, deorbiting the Aristotle in the process, and then set everything up the other end. Yeah, I said that before this mission I thought of several different ways to do it before I settled on this particular one. Well, after I'd finished the mission, I also thought of a couple of other much better ways I could have done this mission, but never mind, eh? With our ship in orbit, we can pop that fairing and have a look at our secret weapon, which is going to make today's task a hell of a lot easier. This is it, just a simple 6-way node with standard docking ports attached. Now, we're not going to be transferring any of the main structure of the Aristotle, that's all going to be deorbited. What we will be transferring is the utility vehicles, the 2 emergency return vehicles, and the 2 space tugs which are currently attached to the space station. The ERVs do have enough delta V on them to take a tug each and travel across to the new space station, but we'd have had to have launched another mission anyway to deorbit the Aristotle and then probably to make its way to the new space station to refuel the ERVs, so we haven't really lost anything by doing it this way. Having arrived at the space station, we come into dock, and now we can start the task of transferring the vehicles and the crew across. Our science duo of Gwenby and Jeblov transfer across to one of those ERVs. Our engineered Dotty transfers across to the other. Our pilot Tommel Kerman will be staying put just for the time being. So with everything in position, we are ready to start transferring things in earnest. We start with Gwenby and Jeblov, who pilot their ERV across to dock with that node, followed quickly by Dotty, who does likewise. With that done, we transfer our tugs across. Now these will be docking onto the 2 remaining docking ports on that node, and after that we detach this entire assembly, but we're not quite done here yet. We still need to deorbit this thing, so with Tommel Kerman holding the Aristotle steady, we manoeuvre the CSM plus guests around to the far end of the space station. This was interesting because the usual problem is you don't have enough RCS thrust on your payload, and that makes manoeuvring difficult, but now we've got far too much. I should have turned off a few of those RCS thrusters with hindsight, but we get there in the end. Tommel transfers across to join Dotty in one of those ERVs. We refuel as much as possible from the station's fuel tanks, and now it is time to say farewell to the Aristotle. We have to be quick here. We fire up our main engine to drop our joint periapsis down to roughly 30,000 metres, and now with the clock ticking we refuel again, we separate, we get clear, and we fire up our main engine once again to recircularise our orbit at about 200 kilometres. With our 7 Kerbals sitting pretty in orbit, we will leave them, just for now, and accompany the Aristotle on its final moments. So it is a day tinged with sadness. The Aristotle has served us well, but we must look forwards, not backwards. Out with the old, in with the new. As one chapter closes, another begins. Sunrise, sunset. Of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most human. Shameless sci-fi references aside though, we have a mission to finish. We start by plotting a course to the new space station. Looking on the map view, I thought for a moment maybe we were a bit too close, but it turns out, no, we're fine, and we get what looks like a good manoeuvre planned. Being this close does mean that we don't need to use quite so much delta V either to start this rendezvous manoeuvre or to slow us down as we're on approach. We do approach it in the dark, but we stop, stay where we are, and just time accelerate forward into that bright sunlight. Docking is once again complicated by the fact that we have a lot of RCS thrust on the front of this combined vehicle. I have disabled all the monopropellant tanks on those ancillary vehicles we've brought from the Aristotle, so we are just running on the CSM's monopropellant tanks, and yeah, we're draining them quite quickly. We do have a fair bit left as we dock though, so it's time to get on with transferring those vehicles across to their new home. We start with the ERVs. One of them has enough fuel left in the command module monopropellant tank to make that manoeuvre. The other one has completely drained it, so we have to re-enable that main tank. But we get them docked, we do likewise with the space tug, and then we use what we can spare from the CSM's tanks to refuel those vehicles as much as possible. With that done then, it's time to sort out our crew. We get our scientists, Gwembia and Jeblorf, into their new lab, we get Dottie into the living quarters, and then we put Tommel into that command module, the cupola module there. We haven't finished quite yet. Just before we left the Aristotle, any remaining experiments we had in the experiment storage container there, we transferred across to the ERVs, and now Gwemby Kerbin is going to get out and transfer those across to the experiment storage containers attached to this new science laboratory. We can now get some data into that lab, get it churning out the science, and it does so at a very healthy rate of 24 science a day. It's been a long mission, so there's probably a sense of relief as Greyfried, Erison and Grados detach themselves from our new space station, but I suppose we'd better give this thing a name. Having called the last one the Aristotle, I decide to call this one the Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, the father of modern philosophy, responsible for so many facets of our modern civilization, who was basically executed for being an irritating smartass. Anyway, it's now time for our Brunel crew to make their way home, for our station crew to continue getting settled in, and for us to end the episode here. I hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. Next time, well, we've got an interplanetary craft rapidly closing in on Kerbin at thousands of meters per second, so we'll have to deal with that, but in good time. For now, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.